Brain is the largest part of the nervous system. Along with spinal cord, brain is part of the central nervous system. However, compared to spinal cord, the outside of the brain is made of gray matter, while the inside is made of white matter. Brain is made of over 100 billion cells. However, generally speaking, we can divide brain into four parts. First, cerebrum. Cerebrum is associated with higher mental function, sensory function, and motor function. Number two, diencephalon. Diencephalon regulates or controls information related to homeostatic processes. Number three, cerebellum, which coordinates a fine-tuned muscular activity. And number four, brainstem, which regulates visceral activities. In this slide, I am highlighting the four different parts of the brain. This area indicates the cerebrum. Cerebellum is located here. This part of the brain makes up diencephalon, and this area indicates brainstem. Cerebrum is made of two cerebral hemispheres, and there's a structure called corpus callosum which connects the two sides. On the surface of cerebrum there are ridges which are called gyrus, and between two ridges you will see grooves which are called sulcus. There are also deep grooves which are called fissures. Cerebrum is made of four lobes. These lobes are named according to the bone they underlie. For example, frontal lobe is located below the frontal bone. Same apply to parietal lobe, temporal lobe, and occipital lobe. There is also a fifth lobe which lies deep in the lateral sulcus. This lobe is called insula. As I said previously, compared to spinal cord, the outside of the cerebrum is made of gray matter, and the inside of the cerebrum is made of white matter. The outer part, which is made of gray matter, is also called cerebral cortex. In the cerebral cortex, you will find cell bodies of neurons, while the white matter is made of the myelinated nerve fibers. This slide shows the lateral view of the human brain. First of all, let's identify the different lobes of the brain. So this area of the brain, which is highlighted in brown color, I'm putting number 1. This represents frontal lobe. Part of the brain which is highlighted in blue color represents temporal lobe. The green color represents parietal lobe, and the purple color represents occipital lobe. There's a fifth lobe also, which is called insula. I'm highlighting here as number 5. If you pull apart, if you separate frontal lobe and temporal lobe, you will be able to see the insula. Also, as you can see in this slide, the brain is made of ridges and grooves. So, for example, here is a groove, here's another groove, here you can see another groove. And the area between the grooves is called ridges. So the grooves are called sulcus, and the area between sulcus are ridges, which is called gyrus. So I'm highlighting gyrus here. There's also two important sulcus that we need to remember. There's a sulcus which in the central part of the brain, or in the central portion, which separates frontal lobe from parietal lobe. I'm highlighting this here in the black color. This represents the central sulcus. There's also another sulcus which separates the temporal lobe from frontal lobe. Again, I'm highlighting this here in this black color. This sulcus is called lateral sulcus. Functions of the cerebrum include interpretation of sensory informations. There's a specific area in the cerebrum which actually senses the sensory information coming from various parts of the body. Cerebrum is also responsible to initiate voluntary muscular movement. Cerebrum has a role in memory and also reasoning. I also want to add that intelligence, which is basically processing the sensory information and making sense out of it in a complex way, and also personality are also associated with cerebrum. Overall speaking, in the outer portion of cerebral cortex, which is made of gray matter, you can find 3 areas. But for this lecture, let's focus only on 2 important areas. Those areas are sensory area and motor areas. Let's start with sensory area first. So which part of the cerebral cortex is responsible for interpretation of various sensory information coming from different parts of the body? So first of all, sensory information coming from the skin, which is also called cutaneous senses, is sensed in the parietal lobe. Occipital lobe interprets sensory information coming from eyes, visual area. Temporal lobe senses or interprets information coming from ears, and nose, the auditory and smell area. In the insula, we find area which interpret information coming from the tongue, taste area. It's worth mentioning that sensory fibers from the peripheral nervous system, coming from the skin, coming from the different sensory organs, cross over in the spinal cord. So that's why the sensory information of the right side of the body is sensed in the left side of the hemisphere, left cerebral cortex. And the sensory information of the left side of the body is sensed in the right side of the cerebral cortex. So make sure to remember this crossover. This crossover occur at the level of brain stem. So the motor areas are found in frontal lobe. If you paid attention, I did not mention any sensory area in the frontal lobe. In the frontal lobe, we find 3 motor areas. First of all, primary motor area, which is responsible for initiating voluntary skeletal muscle movement. Also, Broca's area is in the frontal lobe. This is responsible for muscle movement of speech. And finally, frontal eye field is also found in frontal lobe, and this is responsible for voluntary control of eye movement. Basal nuclei are collection of gray matter located deep within the cerebral hemisphere. There are 3 structures that make up basal nuclei. They include caudate nucleus, putamen, and globus pallidus. The overall function of basal nuclei is to facilitate voluntary movement by smoothing the movement and fine-tuning the movement. And if there is an altered activity of these nuclei, this will lead to abnormal movements such as those seen in patients with Parkinson's disease. In this slide, you can see the location of caudate nucleus, putamen, and globus pallidus in the brain. These 3 structures make up the basal nuclei. In the brain, there are also cavities which are connected to each other. These cavities are filled with a fluid called cerebrospinal fluid. Cerebrospinal fluid is made by ependymal cells, in the brain, these ependymal cells come together and create a larger structure called choroid plexus. Choroid plexus produces cerebrospinal fluid. Cerebrospinal fluid is basically secreted from the choroid plexus located in the two ventricles. These are called lateral ventricles located in the two cerebral hemisphere. From the two ventricles, cerebrospinal fluid enters the third ventricle. This area represents the third ventricle through interventricular foramen. From the third ventricle, fluid enters the fourth ventricle through cerebral aqueduct. And from the fourth ventricle, cerebrospinal fluid enter the spinal cord through central canal. Also, fourth ventricle is associated with subarachnoid space of meninges. This slide shows flow of cerebrospinal fluid in the brain. I think it is worth mentioning that the cerebrospinal fluid flows from the lateral ventricles to the third ventricle and to the fourth ventricle into the central canal of the spinal cord, but eventually cerebrospinal fluid flows in subarachnoid space, this area, and from subarachnoid space it is finally absorbed in the blood. The next part of the brain is called diencephalon, which lies between the cerebral hemisphere and midbrain. Diencephalon is primarily made of gray matter, and the two important structures that you would like to remember for diencephalon are thalamus and hypothalamus. Other structures including diencephalon are especially posterior part of the pituitary gland, pineal gland, and the mammillary bodies. The function of thalamus is to sort all the sensory information coming from different parts of the body through spinal cord and direct those sensory information to a specific part of his cerebral cortex. I think the only exception here is thalamus does not sort or direct sensory information of smell. By sorting the sensory information, thalamus also helps with producing a general awareness of sensations such as pain, touch, and temperature. Hypothalamus has a very important role. The overall function of hypothalamus would be to maintain homeostasis, and it does so by linking the two large systems in our body, which are endocrine system and nervous system. So to break down the function of hypothalamus is that it maintains homeostasis by regulating the heart rate, regulating body temperature, controlling secretion of glands, and producing of hormones. The limbic system of the brain modifies our behavior by producing pleasant or unpleasant feelings such as fear, anger, pleasure, sorrow, and what have you. And by generating these feelings, it increases our chance of survival. Actually, for example, let's say, if something gives us an unpleasant experience, we probably won't do that again. For example, touching a burning spot as a kid, the limbic system helps the kid to not touch that again in the future. There are several structures which make up the limbic system, and it's quite spread apart in different parts of the body. It includes both gray matter and white matter. The next structure is brainstem, which is made of midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. These three structures are located inferior to cerebrum. Out of these three structures, I would like you guys to focus only on medulla oblongata. All the nerve fibers going upward or downward in the nervous system transmits through medulla oblongata. This is also the location where crossover of nerve fibers occur. Additionally, medulla oblongata houses areas for visceral function control. The visceral functions include cardiac center, which regulates heart rate, vasomotor center, which regulates blood pressure, respiratory control center, which regulates the rate and depth of breathing. Additionally, in the medulla oblongata, there are reflex control sites for coughing, sneezing, swallowing, and vomiting. The next part of the brain is called cerebellum, which is located inferior to occipital lobe of cerebrum. Similar to cerebrum, cerebellum is also made of two hemispheres, which is connected in the middle by a structure called the vortex. The outside of cerebellum is made of gray matter, and the inside is made of white matter, which has a tree-shaped like structure, and that is called arbor vitae. Cerebellum is connected with other part of the brain through cerebellum peduncles. The function of cerebellum is to integrate sensory information from different parts of the body and use it to coordinate skeletal muscle activity and maintain posture. It also makes sure that the movement occur in a desired manner. So for example, when you write using your fingers, or when you are doing some fine-tune activities such as painting, brushing, that is facilitated by cerebellum. In this slide you can see cerebellum, which is located inferior to occipital lobe of cerebrum. As you can see that the outer part is gray and the inner part is white. The inner part or white matter has a tree-shaped like structure, which is called arbor vitae. Here you can see the cerebellum peduncle, which connects cerebellum to other parts of the brain. Peripheral nervous system consists of nerves coming out of the brain called cranial nerves, and a nerve coming out of spinal cord called spinal nerves. Peripheral nervous system include both sensory and motor division, and the motor division is further divided based on whether the motor input is ending to a voluntary organ or involuntary organ. If it ends to a voluntary organ such as skeletal muscle, that's called somatic nervous system. If it ends to an involuntary organ such as heart, gut, it's called autonomic nervous system. So there are 12 pairs of cranial nerves arising from different parts of the brain. These nerves are sensory, motor, or they can be mixed as well. Each cranial nerve has a specific function that we need to know. This slide shows the ventral surface or ventral view of the brain. Here you can see that cranial nerves arise from different parts of the body, starting from the cranial nerve number 1, which arises from cerebrum, all the way to cranial nerve number 12, which arises from medulla oblongata. You don't need to know the location of this. I'm not going to bring this picture in the exam asking you to identify different cranial nerves, but just to give you perspective that they arise from different parts of the brain. This table summarizes the important function related to each cranial nerve. So just to simplify for you guys, I'm going to focus on a very important function or essential function of each nerve, but you can go through this table on your own to know the complete function related to each cranial nerve. So starting with cranial nerve number 1, which is called olfactory nerve. This nerve carries sensory information from the nose, and it carries sense of smell. Cranial nerve number 2 is called optic nerve, carries sensory information from the eyes, so basically carries a sense of vision. Cranial nerve number 3, cranial nerve number 4, and cranial nerve number 6. They're involved in the movement of eyeball, so basically provide motor information or motor input to muscles which are responsible for eyeball movement. These nerves are called cranial nerve number 3 oculomotor nerve, cranial number 4 trochlear nerve, and cranial number 6 abducens nerve. Cranial number 5 is called trigeminal nerve. The important function of cranial number 5 is to provide sensory information to the face and also provide motor input to muscles involved in chewing or mastication. Cranial nerve number 7 is called facial nerve. This provides motor input to facial muscles. So basically the muscle that we use when smiling and other facial expression is actually enabled by a facial nerve. Cranial nerve number 8 is called vestibulocochlear nerve. As the name says, it's made of two parts, vestibular branch and cochlear branch. Vestibular branch is associated with sense of equilibrium in the inner ear, and cochlear branch is associated with sense of hearing. Cranial nerve number 9 is called glossopharyngeal nerve. As the name says, it provides sensory information to pharynx, tonsils, posterior part of the tongue. It will also provide motor impulses to the muscle used in the pharynx, which are involved in swallowing. Cranial nerve 10 is called vagus nerve. This is a very important nerve. It provides somatic motor input to muscles of pharynx, which are associated with speech and swallowing. But most importantly, vagus nerve provide autonomic motor fibers to the heart, smooth muscle, and glands in the thorax and an abdominal cavity. Cranial nerve number 11 is called accessory nerve. This provide motor inputs to muscles of pharynx and larynx, but also muscles of the neck and back. And finally, cranial nerve number 12 is called hypoglossal nerve. It provides motor inputs to muscles that move the tongue. Spinal nerves arise from spinal cord. There are 31 pairs of spinal nerves. Most of them are mixed nerve, which means it has both sensory and motor branches. These 31 pairs are named according to their association with vertebrae. So, for example, spinal nerves arising from the spinal nerves or at the level of spinal nerves, the level of cervical vertebrae called cervical nerves, at the level of thoracic vertebrae called thoracic nerve, lumbar nerves, sacral nerve, and coccygeal nerve. Individually, each spinal nerve arises from two roots, one from the anterior part of the spinal cord, which is called ventral root, and one from the posterior part of the spinal cord, which is called dorsal root. So basically, spinal nerve is a combination of dorsal root and ventral root. When spinal nerves are formed from combination of ventral and dorsal root, they exit the vertebral column. And after that, they come together and create networks which are called plexuses. There are three important plexuses that I would like you guys to remember. First of all, cervical plexus, which is formed from the combination of cervical spinal nerve 1 through cervical spinal nerve 4. This plexus provide innervation to muscles and skin of the neck. Brachial plexus is made from cervical spinal nerve number 5 through thoracic spinal nerve number 1. This plexus provide innervation to muscles of the upper extremities, which include shoulder, arm, forearm, and hand muscles. Finally, lumbosacral plexus, which is made from lumbar spinal nerve 1 through sacral spinal nerve number 4, and this plexus provide innervation to muscles of lower extremity. Autonomic nervous system is part of peripheral nervous system. If you remember, I said peripheral nervous system includes both sensory division and motor division. So autonomic nervous system is part of the motor division. However, it's a specific part of the motor division that ends to visceral organs or involuntary organs, such as smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. The overall function of autonomic nervous system is to maintain homeostasis by controlling heart rate, blood pressure, respiratory rate, and body temperature. It also responds to emotional stress. So, for example, responses to stress or to fight or to flight is actually provided by autonomic nervous system. Depending on the type of responses provided by autonomic nervous system, this system is further divided into sympathetic division and parasympathetic division. Sympathetic division is active in conditions of stress or emergency, such as fight or flight, and parasympathetic division is active under normal restful conditions, such as rest or digest. Sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system arises from thoracic and lumbar spinal segments. Nerves in the sympathetic divisions then travel to different parts of the body, and they include smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands located in various parts of our body. On the other hand, the parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system arises from brain and from the sacral segment of the spinal cord. And the nerves then travel, again go to various parts of the body, which include glands, smooth muscles, and cardiac muscles. So basically, glands, smooth muscles, and cardiac muscles are supplied both by sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. However, their response is different. So in this chart, you can see a comparison of sympathetic response versus parasympathetic response. If you look at the each visceral effect or action, you will find that the sympathetic and parasympathetic work kind of opposite of each other. For example, in the pupil of the eye, sympathetic response causes dilation, while parasympathetic response causes constriction. But I think if you put it an overall analogy of that, sympathetic response is activated in the case of fight or flight, and parasympathetic response is activated in the case of rest and digest, then you can make sense of all these various actions. The autonomic nervous system itself is controlled by other parts of the brain and spinal cord. For example, hypothalamus and limbic system are the two important areas in the nervous system which regulates autonomic activity.